Hello, Thrilling Suspense Fanatics. I am bringing you another tale of Averoigne from the Averoigne Legacy, Tribute Tales in the World of Clark Ashton Smith, edited by Edward Stashif. This one is called The Cult of the Singing Flame by David Reid Ross. He gives us a translation from the Latin medieval manuscript, and I really enjoyed the quasi-historical way Averoigne is embodied. Without further ado, I bring you this next story. The Cult of the Singing Flame by David Reid Ross. I, Onfray, have sat too long in this dank monastic cell, too long with no company save your unsmiling attendants outside this dead-bolted oaken door. You say, O tender inquisitors, that this is for my protection. Perhaps you are right. You say you will provide me with quill, ink, and uncouth parchment on condition I use these implements only for my testimony on the recent disappearances from southern Averoigne and on the new heresy reported there. From musical notation you forbid me, and I must write by daylight, as I can no longer abide the dance of an open flame. Your agents have doubtless learnt these facts already from certain unenraptured citizens of afflicted Zeme, and from others in the ambit of her bishop Azedarac, who sent me on my mission, and he whom I divine to be your true target here. I testify that, whatever accusations be whispered against him otherwise, my lord bishop and I have opposed and shunned this heresy as much as you do, if not more so. The Lord be witness over what I write, that I, wretch that I am, be no heretic nor liar. If a flame be my fate, no pyre you can kindle should burn as painfully nor as completely as my heart has burned already. Since your eminences require a complete record, I must start from the beginning. I was a foundling of no parentage, so I am told, and until entering the future bishop's service, I lived all my life far from the siren fires of the Martyrian, within the quiet grey-black mures of the Abbey of Paragon. I am told that Paragon, following the rule of Saint Benoit as it does, imposes a regimen less strict than that of the Cistercian establishments, but for a youth growing to adolescence the regimen was strenuous enough. As an acolyte, my lot was prayer, study, and communal meals. I am, however, grateful for the education I received in Latin and Greek, although I was only passable in the former and remain barely literate in the latter. It is the custom, in Paragon, to shave a tonsure only upon writing correct Latin. I received my crown having the age of 9, later than most. My true passion was in music. I learned the 8 Gregorian and authentic plagal modes, enough to compose some chants for the propers. I loved best the office of vespers, held in the dark grey chapel as the westering sun behind us cast golden highlights upon the sacred table. In this mass, you understand, the classes of singers may vary their tune, even in polyphonic harmony. Would that I could sing to the Lord only the old songs. On the feast of Zenobia Martyr, the penultimate day of October, it was our custom to issue forth from the abbey, rustling through the falling russet leaves to the local village's church, where reveres some minor clerics of that saint. Some of my compositions are perhaps still sung in that little country church, albeit not likely in Paragon Abbey itself. Not any more. Not since word reached them I had seen and heard the flame. Certain of my fellow acolytes would follow a rather more independent pilgrimage to Saint Zenobie, especially after Vespers on the Fête du Saint Samedi. Pleading your pardon, the Benedictine rule has forbidden such, but in Paragon some monks could be persuaded to make themselves scarce as the boys set out and returned from their nocturnal peregrinations. I suspect that the abbot himself was not blind to their excursions. This was means to discern the sheep, called to the rule, from the young goats, called to serve in other ways, although the goats were not always discerned quickly. I was not the only lad there miraculously born of a Zenobian virgin. On mine own first ventures alongside my peers, I hesitated to join fully in their merriments, being still very young, and fearing to transgress more of the rule than I already had. They quaffed the local golden vintages. I made do with boiled and flavored water. I sat by the wall near the flickering flames to hear the chanteurs. Many of their songs even some of your eminences will have heard, of the unhappy Count Gerard de Ventillon, lured into the ruins near Paragon by the will-o'-the-wisps there and consumed, of the fair-haired Baroness Jael de Joiry, returned from Hadean depths with a poisoned kiss for her despoiler. The minstrels employed a form of parallel and oblique organum polyphony in how they played their chords. Most of their songs were like ours, at least structurally. In our system, they would approximate the first and fourth authentic modes. Others of their songs were in musical arrangements less easily assigned. I hasten to point out the same holds true for certain of our hymns, especially the older ones. As I learnt more of songcraft, in my youthful arrogance, I argued with my teachers over which hymns belonged in modal form, and which could be improved, or, perhaps, restored. And during my last spring in the Abbey, I began furtively courting a buxom, auburn-haired maiden of Saint Zenobie. Acolytes grinned, monks cast glances. At the last, before it could become a scandal, my bunk was overturned and my secrets revealed. An ode to la baignée entre toutes les femmes in that popular fourth, a version of the Magnificat in the second plagal, and several other less finished works on the theme. The abbot, upon summoning me to his office, got from me the full truth, including the name of the maiden. It turned out that this name had been oft repeated in the Abbey, and I was apprised that the true object of my hymn was in character more like that of other Maria. So I shall name her here, my heart, my damnation, my Madeline. After that my aspect became, I am ashamed to confess, sullen and resentful, and my studies suffered as a result, nor was I a boon companion to my fellow acolytes. So, on the last week of that October, when the then Archdeacon Azedarac strode into our refectory, scanning us with black and yellow eyes, and called out for an assistant for the great church in Zim, one who could read and write Latin, and could follow musical notation, more than one face turned in my direction, and the gloom on my face was lightened. And so I, no longer bound to Benoit's rule, but still in the church, ended up outside the sheltering grey walls of Paragon, with my few personal effects packed, bidding farewell to my childhood home. As my brothers in the Abbey made their way to Saint Zenobie, I turned my face instead to the wilder musics of the wind-tossed autumnal forest, beckoning to me like a great conflagration. The roads of Averoigne are not always free of wolves, on 4 legs or 2, so Archdeacon Azedarac had brought a small company of men-at-arms. As I had never ventured far from the shelter of Paragon, I had much to learn about our destination Zim. As we rode out together beneath the Averoignard oaks and pines, I plied my companions with questions. Azedarac, not being much encumbered with the virtue of humility, was more than pleased to fill a willing ear. In the evenings, whilst the moths fluttered about our firelit faces, the Archdeacon's men-at-arms, led by Vulpine Jehan, spun tales of Averoigne. Some of these I knew from the Saint Zenobie tavern, like the sad end of Comte Gerard, others, like the tale of the satyr of La Frenais, or of the gargoyles of the cathedral city, were then unknown to me, and their heterodox content certainly would never have been permitted in the cloister of Paragon. The Zim I knew from my studies was a city of many thousands of souls, and the seat of a bishopric subject to the cathedra in Villon. Azedarac informed me further of his master, Bishop Gorai, an elderly fellow, tolerant as bishops go, as inoffensive to the lowly Averoigne priests as he was to the Roman curia. At last we scented the smoke of the charcoal burners who live outside any notable settlement. We passed some inns, and anon we crested a rise and gazed down upon the great wooden walls of Zim. And what a sight it was, the vermilion haze of thousands of stove fires mingling with the vapors of the river Isoil, the walls in a circle looming over the cleared fields around, and at the center of the town the great church of the bishop. The next few days went by as if in the sepia fog from the river. Within the church grounds I was introduced to my chamber, much more splendid than the poor pallet I had as a humble acolyte, with a single bed and a desk, and shelves well stocked with Andalusian paper. Paper! In Paragon we were still scrubbing old deerskin for palimpsests. I was also introduced to my tutors, who would be furthering my studies in Latin and Greek and in music. The archdeacon had even recruited for his bishopric a teacher of Arabic and Hebrew, a Jew having fled the Mussulmans of Algranad. I think that even the cathedral city Villon was not then endowed with such savants. And there was the music. My patron, Azedarac, had made known that here in Zim was a market for cosmopolitan compositions, and that coin was at hand for any novelties of quality. Here in Zim I was encouraged to attend the taverns, if only I brought my pen and paper. What contrast with Paragon! Minstrels from all Europa swarmed into the streets of this once humble city, rough bards of the Angleterre, seductive chanteurs of the Franks, gallant poets of the Andalusi. Not all of the jongleurs and chanteurs were of our faith. Not all the songs I transcribed were in languages even known to Christendom. As the leaves turned on the trees, more trouvères arrived from even further afield, the peripatetic rom from the Byzantine counties, and the travellers of the Eire. Some told terrific tales of a dark land in Abchazi, of blood-drinkers in Hungary. It seemed to me that Zim had become a Gala Baghdad, an auditory for 1,001 songs. Some of my fellow clerics, however, made sour comparisons with the more ancient Mesopotamian metropolis, whose king had consigned the 3 saints to the furnace. As the months went by, and as my hair grew out, Azedarac, tonsured himself, saw no purpose in baldness on a lapsed Benedictine assistant. I gained more of my master's trust, and was permitted to travel afield. Later I travelled as far as Lutece de Parises, wherein I read the library of Our Lady's grand cathedral, saints preserve it, the books of polyphony assembled by its magisters. So it went for more season turnings, and in A.D. 1166 the time came when our good Bishop Gorai went home to our Lord. Azedarac led the requiem mass at his bier. I, still only 17 summers old, was called to conduct the elegiac hymns. In my pride I desired to add my own voice to the chorus. I had attended funerals in Paragon, and I never disliked their songs about Jour de la Colère, so I had some notions about the content and style befitting my theme, without changing the content of the vocals nor the trochaic structure, which would cast disgrace on me and on my patron. I endeavored that night to adjust the music. Where the traditional music was sorrowful throughout, I introduced themes of communality, by polyphony, and of hope, by raising the tenor, gathering force at the end. In this task I struggled, not knowing the late bishop as well as those born of Zim knew him. I admit that in the quivering candlelight I recalled my Madeline, abandoned in Saint Zenobie, but not forgotten, never to be forgotten. The choir sang my song, such as it was. As it concluded, I glanced over to my master Azedarac. I will not say he was emotionally moved. He could not have been, but no sneer crossed his lips in that moment, and during some of my cadences his dark eyes went unfocused and their spark more sombre, which I took for compliment enough. The late Bishop Garai was duly interred in the catacomb with his predecessors in the cloth. It seems I had not disgraced my patron, at least, a few days later. Archbishop Clement summoned Archdeacon Azedarac to Vion. Clement returned him to us as our new bishop. Little changed in my position as Azedarac assumed the mitre. I had heard rumors that our overseer was perhaps not the holiest man in the parish. All knew then, as well you know now, that he was not even ordained as a priest before ascending to the episcopacy. But all allowed that no woman nor young man of the parish would speak a word against him. He had faithfully served the church in Zim, albeit in a secretarial capacity, without misstep, and if Azedarac seemed a student more of matters scientific or even alchemical than spiritual, at least there was no introduction of Mahometan or Byzantine heresies in the liturgies, and, dare I say, the choir was good. As for Azedarac as an administrator, his hand was a light one, and it only lightened with time. He left secular affairs to his hound Jehan. The conduct of the Mass he left to his priests and to myself. Some now curse him for negligence, or worse, they shun us, his creatures, as if we were devils, like Jehan, qui mauvais en soi, and so I hear. But what did I know of the mundane duties of bishops? For my part, he left me free to bring mine own compositions to the great church. Already we, who were charged with such duties, noticed that from Zim and from its environs came to us fewer funerals, fewer burials of the elderly and infirm, and as I walked the town streets I observed that more than one undertaker had hung up his shingle. If I heard of someone in town who had passed away unshriven, their friends and relations would say that his or her sun had set, an idiom foreign to me and, I was informed in hushed tones, foreign to Christ. Azedarac kept his own counsel, and the rest of us had not yet registered this matter as serious. But then the confirmations thinned, the baptisms were postponed, and finally even mass attendance dropped. Such could not be ignored. The remnant Christian faithful cast aspersions upon the priests for their sloth and gluttony. This sentiment made its way to the more daring chanteurs. The priests, tightening their belts, muttered that my patron was perhaps haunted by demons of Ascedia. But we still had weddings amongst our remnant faithful, and one damp and sleety winter I received a letter from my Madeline of St. Zenobie. She was well, had mended her ways, was improving her handwriting, was still irritated by the local yokels, and wondered how her favorite bard was faring. My heart shuddered as a bird swooning over a volcano. My gut roiled like its magmal cauldron. In such a fever I wrote back to her. I was remiss for not contacting her first. I assured her I was well, and, hinting, still unattached, I threw in some wry comments about this city, and observed it was lacking in the warmth of her presence. Over the weeks more ardent missives passed between us, and then she hinted that soon enough she might be traveling in this direction herself. Flushed with this emotion with no outlet, I did what any young man in my position would do. I composed a march. I had occasion to test my composition for the nuptial of two scions of the Zim notables. A few days later, as if on cue, I heard my tune underlying a decidedly less sacramental lyric drifting through the sunlight glow of a tavern window. In my vanity, I ducked in. By chance, I saw the young newlyweds gaily singing along with the ribald chorus. As they finished, some men and women came into the tavern. Their preternaturally lean frames were modestly cloaked in tan and yellow tunics, fastened with golden brooches, each shaped like a flame. They proposed, in Rhinelander accents, to play a tune of their own. The innkeep seemed reluctant, but some of his patrons recognized them and insisted, and so the troupe assumed their positions at the minstrel's dais and brought out their instruments. Besides that, they were all wind instruments. I was unfamiliar with them all, not even of their material. One was something like a transverse flute, another perhaps an ocarina, or some bloated Moorish shawm. Thus equipped, they performed that damnable concerto, the Chant of the Flame. Its melodies were not of the 8 modes, nor of the old modes of the Mozarabes and Latins. These were perhaps not of any mode possible on earth. The very chords seemed to defy Pythagorean geometry. The overall oeuvre was transporting to the degree that no one else spoke. As they played, the flames of the hearth seemed to dance in tune with the music like rippling lorelei. The barmaids seemed colder to the patrons for it. Even the newlyweds seemed less focused on each other than on the music. I was swept away myself. When they ceased playing, the calls for them to continue were so raucous the bouncers started to clench their fists. Something in me suggested that a minion of the bishop might not be welcome much longer, so I quickly settled my account and slipped out into the night. As I wandered home, a part of me wondered about making use of the new alien melody to entice the lady of my thoughts, should we ever meet again. Another part was jealous that mine own composition, which I had thought a good one, might now be forgotten. And that night, in my bed, as I restlessly fidgeted, I pondered if there was some threat here, at least to other chanteurs and churchmen. We all serve the good folk in our own way, if we might not agree on much else. Hearing in my mind a fragment of the eldritch music, I suddenly realized that, somehow, I was already dressed for a journey and packing my bags. I knew then that I must inform my patron and bishop. The next morning, in the church offices, as I approached the bishop's oaken door, I noticed the hypnotic flicker of the flame-like lights along its cracks that were not like the lights of a taper. I almost had to beat the door down when, at last, it opened. The room was bathed in a weird, inconstant glow from the wall-mounted mirror, whose face, instead of reflecting the contents of the chamber, or so it appeared to me, was like the screen shielding a blazing kiln. This hidden flame illuminated the pages of no less than 2 open codices and 1 partly unrolled scroll, all of a dubious and non-Latinate script. Azedirach's dark gaze looked more jaundiced than usual, and, as it lighted upon mine, angered at the introduction. His fist clenched as if to strike a blow, and then sagged as if aging decades before my eyes. "Enter," the bishop invited me, "and shut the door behind you." I told my patron of the song at the tavern. Azedirach listened, then asked me to recite the tune. When he heard what I could repeat of it, his face locked up and the hook-shaped scar over his eyes lost its color. In his silence, I begged to be allowed to track down the font of this otherworldly melody. The Cistercians are already suspicious of this whole province, I reminded him, and the uncouth Franks of the north have never abandoned their ambitions for imperium over the Latins and all 3 parts of Gaul. If the archbishop should cast his gaze here, we are ruined. It seemed to me, as I spoke, he concealed the content of his truer suspicions, but I was consumed with my obsessions. Alas, I do not think that even my Madeline, had she appeared at that moment, could have dissuaded me. In the end I wore the man down. He charged me with finding the source of the candle song. For a while I heard little enough of this strange music. I learnt little more save that it was somehow associated with the dark massif to our southwest, whence we quarry the bulk of our stone, the price of which was rising these days. This massif was, I knew, whither those of Zim were dying would travel these days, but such parties were secretive, such that I could not yet insinuate myself. Meanwhile, from the homes of those sunsetted, paper documents were brought to me by the concerned Christian friends, and from those more reluctant whose tongues were loosened at my bishop's inquiries. You, my jailers, have read from these codices. They contain Scripture, but arranged in a peculiar order, as Florilegia. We saw an abridgment of Luke and Acts, certain sections of Paul, but not in the canonical order, the anecdote of the 3 saints of Babylon, but not associated with the book of Daniel, the first chapter of John's Gospel, and its priestly prayer, dissociated from the Evangel. My investigations were all very frustrating and lonely, since I, as a church creature, was now being shunned by the common man of Zim, but at least now I had the comfort of my lovely correspondent outside Zim. I have retained some of our letters, and sometimes I cannot help but reread them. But to return to my account, at last we were given to understand that certain of our healthier citizens, whose absence from Mass was being noticed as well as their abstention from the local inns, were making ready to depart our city. Azeterac took credit, in his priest's presence, for his successful crackdown. We, who were more directly involved, knew that there had been no crackdown, but an inquest only, yet we knew enough to utter no word to contradict our master. We also knew that this was our chance to track the conflagration of heresy to its source. If only someone could join this caravan's train, someone with no attachments except to Zim and to her church, someone like me, or so I counseled my Lord Bishop. To this petition, to my ruin, my Lord Bishop acceded. Thus I found my way into this group. We set out from the wall of Zim on foot to venture west under the pines and oaks into the shadowed hills. Along the way we passed other men and women of Zim traveling on my way, singing the siren song like pilgrims. Also we passed other men traveling the other way, toward Zim, these mostly men and women of the hills, not singing like apostles. As I already knew, the latter would look upon my person with distrust or even menace, I deemed it wise to stash my rosary and other Christly accoutrements in my luggage. Of my group, many were old and sick, such that they were carried in carts. My companions were vague about what they sought. They did not fully know themselves. They had heard that in the hills was a way to consolation. These pilgrims hoped to discover it, and if they found it to be deemed worthy of consolement, to my ear it all sounded quite final. There were some, they told me in tentative tones, whom consolation returned to roam the world like friars. These bore a small golden pin in the shape of a flame, like that which those minstrels in town had borne, but they numbered few. None of them accompanied us, that I knew, that had merely directed our flock to the road that we travelled. I asked after those suppliants from Zim who we had not observed any more in our midst, if they too had roamed the world. This they would not tell me, but were visibly uncomfortable, and altered the course of our conversation. Other paths merged into ours, and other groups of pilgrims joined with ours, and at last we came to the crossroads, to Paragon and Saint Zenobier, and thence, leading to a group of about 5, came my auburn-haired Madeline, and she remembered me. We fell in together to discuss the past few years. She was eager to learn more of Zim's, I to catch up on events in Paragon and Saint Zenobier. As we continued to ascend the massif, and as the trees turned to pine, we spoke of matters more personal. Whilst I was away, my Madeline had wearied of the sneers and advances of the townfolk, and even of certain monks, grown heartsick of the lovers after vespers who did not tarry for the lauds. It was her intent to be washed clean, as St. John had prophesied, in a medium other than water. It occurred to me that John's winnowing bonfire would not end well for the chaff, but I heeded not that still small voice. At that moment I would have followed my Madeline to the carmine lips of Gehenna. That evening by the camp's main fire she announced to everyone that I, Onfray, was the finest songwright in the county, and she begged me to entertain our companions of the road. Blushing, I gathered some musicians, then led them to sing my wedding song, altered toward that bawdy variant I'd heard in the Zeme Tavern, which was now spreading like spring leaves among the jongleurs. This being a success, we moved on to other songs to wide approval, but my Madeline's firelit eyes radiated upon me sufficient approval. Our swollen throng crested a rise, and I witnessed the pilgrim's destination. In the midst of a treeless vale sat a dark and rectangular town, walled around. This burg looked recently and hastily constructed. It was built of pine, but many of its habitants, all very thin, were rebuilding the larger establishments by means of the local basalts. The usual city of our type, you recall, is circular. This settlement had more of the character of a Roman camp. At the center of this dusky castra was a great building, likewise rectangular, but red and tall like a candle in the gloom, with a colossal port barred by stout doors of yellow wood I could not recognize. On closer look, the edifice proved unpainted. Its crimson stone did not look like the surrounding massive basalts, nor like the granites of our Alps, nor yet as the marbles of the Lusitane. The blocks did not even look like the Averoignian make, nor Roman, nor of any style of which I am familiar. Later, I would recall an illustrated Pausanias in Aziderac's office depicting the lion-guarded gate of Mycene, the walls around which, so the Greeks related, the Cyclops had built. As soon as we entered the town camp's atramentous walls, we were lodged in a humble barracks-like inn with no tavern. Prominent on one wall was a strange painting of a vast field of some alien lavender studded with immense standing stones, in the midst of which arose a red stone city, all below an orange sky with no sun. It needed no urging for us to understand that we had alighted upon a sacred site with limited space for such revelry as we had enjoyed on the road. On wakening, the centurions of this strange new settlement set us tasks to earn our keep. Our valuables were confiscated to be held in common. Anyone who objected was politely sent on their way out of camp. Most of us who stayed there were asked to assist with construction or quarrying, replacing the wooden buildings with the local stone. Those with more specialized skills, like medicine, were assigned to the relevant stations, or reassigned if other duties needed them more. For my part, I, as a literate man, but not entrusted with secretarial secrets, was assigned some basic scribal work including the copying and translation of biblical florilegia. It worried me that I was contributing to the dissemination of possibly heretical literature, but there was nothing in there yet which could attract the attention of a Cistercian. The leaders of this castra, bearing the xanthric seal of the flame, were electi. Those so dignified preferred Latin or Greek for the title. These, we found out, had endured the fasts and entered the Scarlet Building, and, the people noted, with fateful implications, had returned thence. We sometimes passed electi by the structure. They would gaze at its yellow port as if listening for a music the rest of us could not hear. On their faces was the haunted look of Adam and Eve outside Eden, facing the angelic guards and their incandescent swords. We learned only at the end of their natural lives would the electi be permitted back through its gates. As such, it was always with heavy hearts that they ever left the compound on official business. We others were provincially labeled as Ausidors, because our lot was to pay heed and to learn. we celebrated no Mass. Each night I prayed for forgiveness for this in secret. We instead attended lessons, as did the first disciples of Christ before the Paschal Supper. The Latin Church, they instructed us, was at best a waypoint, like directing this mainly to us from Zim, the inn of Bonne Jouissance, en route to the cathedral city Villon, except that the true seat of God was in a place not in this world and unknown to Catholics. Between the sexes the camp was roughly divided into male and female. The electee conducted no sacrament nor even ceremony for what we know as marriage. They did preside and mediate over pairings betwixt the sexes, or even, I beg your pardons, betwixt the same. The only rule was that no issue could flower from such passions. Several electee, mostly male, wooed Auxidors. As I was a musician, I too attracted the notice of our superiors. But I had eyes only for the lady of my thoughts, and all my music was composed for her ears. The camp afforded no place for marriage songs, so I turned to more secular tropes of tragic love, of Paul and Thecla, of Olivier de Moutoir and Adèle de la Frenais, of Blaise Renard and Nicolette Villon. Whether Auxidor or elect, those of us most near to death, and I was beginning to envy them, were taken into the great red building, which the electee called the Martyrion. Such went there in pomp, in solemn joy, heralded with song, wholly unlike our funerals and more like our weddings. We Auxidors were not informed of their destination when they did not return to us. We had one, however, an elect, who had collapsed and died before he could make this journey. His luckless corpse was borne to a crematorium outside the camp, and a service was performed there more familiar to Christians. I wondered to myself why, to the electee, a soul was assured of heaven in the Martyrion, but could only be prayed for outside of it. I could conjure no reason that was not grossly heretical to the point of Mahometan, or worse. I could only count my rosary beads in secret and collect the information my bishop had required, at least when not thinking of my lady. On one evening it was announced to us that the time of consolation was at hand. The gates to the village, or camp, were to be closed. None might enter nor leave but the brooch-bearing electee and those in most dire need, but those once outside our camp might not return. Those of us who desired to be baptized anothen in the Greek were first to be made perfect by fasting. This would be a 40-day endurance like that of Lent. For us, volunteering to join the perfecti was not precisely encouraged. The electee warned us that the fast was so strenuous we might not all survive it. We had all learnt by now that the crematorium gaped ever open for those who hoped to enter the Martyrion, but proved unworthy. I was one of those who stayed apart from these perfecting ordeals. Still, many rose to the task, among whom was my flame-haired Madeline of Saint Zenobier. Those days of endurance were the hardest to bear of all days I spent in that accursed place. As the once buxom lady of my thoughts wasted away before me, and as we all were warned, among the fasters were those too weak to endure. Some broke the fast, many just collapsed, and of those who did, the doctors ruled some must be taken at once to the Martyrion. One couple was caught right in the refectory pantry, surrounded with half-eaten food and clad shamefully only in oil and syrup. These two were expelled in disgrace, and I can only imagine the songs that are sung of them. For my part, over these weeks my songs grew ever more ardent and desperate for my Madeline. Despite that I was not officially fasting, I had not eaten much more than she had. On the last night the two of us stole out under the stars alone and took the aside together, though I shall spare your most pious ears the amorous details, except that we passed it and that I, as a Christian bound to my bishop, still had not broken the vows of my chastity. As we held each other afterward, we gazed on the spinning constellations and discussed everything except our likely parting on the morrow. This left unspoken, there was nothing left for us but to return to our camp, to catch what sleep we could. On the next morn we assembled at the jaundiced port of the Red Martyrion, looming over us like a sanguine Punic temple. The prefecti who had survived the Endura were clad in white robes. I saw my pale Madeline there, having survived both the fast and the assay, her bone-thin frame holding up her robes like a mast holding a fluttering sail. One of the electi then delivered a sermon, making reference to a scripture at once familiar and exotic. The mind-numbing content of this sermon may have been part of its intent. I cannot recite it all, but I remember most of the end. Perhaps one of your eminences might make more of this. As the Saviour said to James, brother of the Lord, "Therefore trust in me, my brethren. Understand what the great light is. The Father has no need of me, for a father does not need a son, but it is the Son who needs the Father, though I go to him, for the Father of the Son has no need of you." The Church imagines it holds the key to the kingdom of God. The Mussulmans pretend to have the keys to the garden. Even the Abbey nation fasts and prays, and seeks to work their congregants' way to heaven. Nay, of them our Saviour demands to know. Or do you think perhaps that the Father is a lover of mankind, or that he is won over without prayers, or that he grants remission to one on another's behalf, or that he bears with one who asks? The great yellow doors of the Martyrion opened, and we saw beyond it nothing but wavering red lights, like a bonfire with no visible fuel, as if from an unseen Tophet. We, starved out, or cored out from watching our loves starved, groaned and swayed before the cold and infernal blaze, and the scarlet walls of the Martyrion seemed to grow before us, to bend in our direction, or orthogonally to any direction, in defiance of all laws of Euclid or Archimedes. We hallucinated that beyond the fires beckoned to us the red stone city under the orange sky. If we knew that this was not the promised Jerusalem, we no longer cared. The elect went on preaching, beneath or through this abomination of space and time, and granted unto James, brother of the Lord, as he wrote it in his book, "Therefore become seekers for death, like the dead who seek for life, for that which they seek is revealed to them, and what is there to trouble them? As for you, when you examine death, it will teach you election. Verily, as I say unto you, none of those who fear death will be saved, for the kingdom belongs to those who put themselves unto death. Become better than I. Make yourselves like the Son of the Holy Spirit." And now, reaching out to us from beyond those towering yellow doors, as if to conduct that infernal shimmer, was the rumor of an eldritch vocal symphony, whose melodies the jongleurs of the elect could only hint to us before. We yearned toward the song and the flames, swaying in tune, our jaws slack, some jaws drooling. Many of us started towards it, but our guards, themselves struggling internally, held us back. It was all I could do not to push past them for a taste of immolation. And the preacher modulated his voice with Moloch's lambent piping, so each bolstered the other. As for James, and when we had passed beyond that place, we sent our mind farther upwards, and saw with our eyes and heard with our ears hymns and angelic benedictions and angelic rejoicing, and heavenly majesties were singing praise, and we, too, rejoiced. But of course only the prefecti could join those celestial majesties. The electee arranged them in a line. Their chief rolled out a scroll and recited their names, one by one, and each one entered those gates of trilling fire, and none returned. As the electee called out the lady of my thoughts, she docilely took one step toward the hungry red-gold flame writhing and cantillating behind those terrific yellow doors, and faltered. She turned her eyes to me, seemed about to speak, but I did nothing. Then she smiled at me sadly and turned back to the port. As she passed the Martyrion's yellow threshold towards the Flamme Chantante, someone screamed out. There was a tussle in the crowd. I cannot remember, except that when I was outside the camp and the gates were being shut and locked in my face, and I was the one screaming, still screaming, my voice cracking. I remember some of what I was shouting then. You would have your Holocaust consume us all. What kind of gods demand a world without humanity? What kind of love is this without even children? But nothing I could argue before the pitiless wooden walls would budge them. At the end I hurled myself against them like a beast and pounded upon them, also to no avail. I fell to the ground. I wept. I lay there like a stone for hours, and I think some of the people inside those walls looked down upon me, as if in judgment. And then my back, and stumbled down to Zim. Editor's note: this account has been translated from a Latin manuscript, hand-copied in, we think, the 16th century. It is mostly intact, save at the end, partially burned, although we suspect that a copyist has abridged sections he deemed irrelevant, vis-a risque nature, and has inlined some glosses. Penultimate day of October. To protect our sources, we cannot divulge how we acquired a fax of this text. Of most interest to philologers and historians, besides the record of this cult, thus far, unausgesprochen, we will be its quotes from a pretend book by St. James. These are strikingly close to passages from the Apocryphon unearthed at Nag Hammadi. The parallels are so close that, for the sake of this reproduction, we deferred to the Francis Williams translation at the online Gnostic Society Library. This text would also be of use to musical theorists, were the manuscript less damaged. It appears that Onfray disobeyed the command not to pen any musical notes, because the manuscript clearly once bore such, here and there on the margins and more fully at the end. But some later hand has blotted over the marginal notes and even attempted to burn the ending, and we find occasional stains whose nature we hesitate to consider. It is a pity that we, too, could not listen to the music which so bewitched our author and those around him, for ongoing attempts to reconstruct the notation of C.F. Zaire Gilman et al., Miskatonic University, 2017. The end. I think you'll agree with me that this story contains a number of references both to the real world, the broader historical world, and the kind of pulp fiction world of authors like C.L. Moore, H.P. Lovecraft. The astute among you will no doubt have heard reference to Gyril of Jowry, whose tales are also housed on this channel. If you haven't listened to them, you should. I think the language here is certainly wonderful. It is a little bit different than Clark Ashton Smith's language, but I'm not surprised that it's different. I just enjoy what has been accomplished here, and I hope you enjoyed it too. I hope that you will like, comment, subscribe, and also check out the links in the description, which will afford you the opportunity to purchase Thrilling Suspense Fantasy, my own comics and pulp fiction of similar ilk. Have a nice rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video.